Welcome to Only 90s Kids Will Remember, the feature, Gaming Edition. The world now is a very different place than it was in the 90s, but the gaming industry in particular has changed beyond recognition. Ours is an industry that is hugely reliant on technology and its rapid growth, and as such, it's constantly and drastically changing. It's changed so much, in fact, that things that were once widespread staples are now little more than hazy memories. In this feature, we'll be talking about 15 such things that many of us still think back on fondly, and in some cases, not so. Blowing into cartridges. Optical discs are now the most commonly used media form in our industry, barring the Switch. But back in the 90s, especially the early 90s, it was all about cartridges. And cartridges, as many of us will remember, came with their fair share of issues. Our consoles and handhelds often refused to read cartridges entirely, and the first step most of us immediately took was to blow into the cartridge and then put it back into the console. And you know what? Most of the time, it actually worked. Saves. Save states weren't always possible in games, but even when they did become a widely used feature, they weren't implemented too well. Often, cartridges came with batteries of their own, which is how they stored their data, and losing save files if anything happened to them was all too common. On handhelds like the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, this problem was even more common. Archaic online play. Online play makes up for half of the industry now, but over 2 decades ago, things were very different. Most games did not even have online options. With the advent of the N64 and the first PlayStation, online play in games became slightly more common, while PC gaming started implementing it a lot more as well. But a lot of us had to resort to archaic methods like dial-up internet to even be able to get online. Sega. People born on this side of 2000 may not remember this, but Sega was once a force to be reckoned with in the industry. Now, don't get me wrong, they're still one of the biggest third-party publishers and have an excellent lineup of games and properties under their belt, but back in the 90s, they were major players in the console market as well. They routinely and consistently gave stiff competition to Nintendo with their games and with their consoles, to the point where the Genesis is still considered one of the greatest consoles of all time. Platformers galore. The current generation of games is dominated by open-world titles, and the previous generation was all about first-person and cover-based third-person shooters. But the genre that dominated the gaming scene for the most prolonged period of time is, and probably always will be, is platformers. From the litany of side-scrolling platformers that defined the late 80s and early to the mid-90s, to the likes of Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and many others that dominated the industry as we moved into the age of polygonal 3D graphics, the very concept of video games was once synonymous with platformers. Multi-disc games. We're now living in a time where absolutely massive games easily fit onto even more massive Blu-ray discs, while the advent of digital distribution means that many games don't even release physically. But back when optical discs were starting out as the most commonly used media format for games, seeing games release on multiple discs wasn't too uncommon. In fact, many games ended up releasing across multiple discs. This is something that we saw a lot of even as recently as the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation, but back in the late 90s, multi-disc games were even more common than they'd ever been. Getting actual manuals with games. Digital distribution continues to overtake the industry, but even for those who still prefer physical purchases, things are a bit different, in that very few games now come with something as simple as actual game manuals. Back in the 90s, hell, even as early as last gen in fact, games would come with proper game manuals, many of which would often contain interesting text to read about the game's world and characters, and beautiful illustrations from the artist and the development team. Now, all we get most of the time is either something that can barely pass for a leaflet, or nothing at all. Demo discs. The concept of demos itself has become a bit dated now, though we do get plenty of betas. But even when we do get demos, the way to get them is to digitally download them. Once, though, our purchases of games were often rewarded with demo discs for other titles. In fact, often, these demo discs were used as a marketing ploy to get people to purchase games in order to get demos for other hugely anticipated titles. Being starved for information. Information about games we're curious about or looking forward to is never too far away now. The internet is flooded with details on games, with leaks, with new trailers and screenshots, and more. But back in the day, when we were fervently awaiting a game's launch, we often had to go months and months on end without any new updates. We'd leaf through new issues of magazines to cling to every new word about upcoming releases. We'd wait for the aforementioned demo discs, and even new trailers for games were either a rarity or just didn't happen at all. Local multiplayer. Back in the 90s, local multiplayer was the best and most dominant way of playing games with friends, be it local competitive play for games like GoldenEye 007 or couch co-op for basically every other game that ever existed, or best of all, something that's become a huge rarity in the current landscape, split-screen play in a bevy of major and minor releases. There was something satisfying about playing with or against your friends while sitting in the same room, without having to type stuff in an online chat or yell through gaming headsets. No patches or DLCs. Worldwide launches are hardly the end of the road for games now. In most cases, a launched product isn't usually a finished product. In response to fan feedback, developers will release constant updates and patches to improve their games, while often releasing entirely new pieces of content with post-launch DLC. Back in the 90s though, things were a bit different. Publishers released games and that was it. On one hand, it was comforting to know that the final product was all that there was going to be, and you wouldn't have to pony up extra money later for DLCs or season passes. On the other hand, games would often launch in broken states, and there'd be no patches to fix them. So it wasn't exactly all sunshine and rainbows. No microtransactions. What's the first thing we ask ourselves whenever we think about a new upcoming major release? Well, how will it be monetized? Will there be pay-to-win mechanics? Will there be loot boxes? What's the season pass going to be like? Such concerns simply were not a thing back in the 90s or even a few years afterwards. You paid for a game and that was it. No in-game purchases, no cosmetic purchases, and no randomized surprise mechanics. How far storytelling in games has come. More and more, we see games growing as a medium for storytelling, with not just better visuals and top-notch cinematography, but also better lighting and the widespread use of facial and motion capture to sell players on characters with excellent performances. But anyone who was playing games back in the 90s will tell you that storytelling in this medium has come a long way. There were still some great examples of games telling excellent stories back then, while even now there's a lot of room for improvement. But it wasn't uncommon to see games only having cursory narrative setups, and at times even no stories at all. Checkpoints. Games now have a tendency to hand checkpoints out every chance they get. Just finished a fight? Checkpoint. Just entered or exited a building or a dungeon? Checkpoint. Just finished a chapter? Checkpoint. Such was not the case back in the day. Checkpoints were usually few and far between if they were a thing at all. All too often, games were happy to just not have checkpoints at all, and dying in the middle of a level usually meant having to redo the entire thing all over again. Lack of quality of life features. Games these days usually tend to go out of their way to make things easier for the player. Ease of use, however, wasn't something that games back during the 90s valued all too much. Aforementioned checkpoint issues aside, there was a whole lot else that gamers had to deal with. From weird controls to finicky cameras with the advent of 3D gaming to cluttered user interfaces and loads more. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.